Thank you so much for joining us today on Watchdog, the Mint Press podcast, which looks at organizations and policies which are in the public interest to know about. We are going against the grain and casting a light on stories which are often ignored by the mainstream corporate media. It is for that reason that I ask you to like, subscribe, and to support Mint Press on Patreon and all of the interviewees that you will see on this podcast. So to start with, this week has been business as usual for the US Pentagon and the President Joe Biden. We have seen him bomb Somalia, adding to the list of Syria and Iraq, countries that he has bombed within the first few months of his presidency. Let's not forget that his former commander-in-chief, Barack Obama, launched over 100,000 airstrikes and sent US Special Operations Forces to around 138 countries. In fact, if Barack Obama was to apologize to one civilian drone victim every single day, it would take him about 3 years to apologize to them all. We also know that Daniel Hale, the NSA whistleblower, is due to be sentenced this week. He has sent an 11-page handwritten letter to the judge. We know that he pled guilty after being charged under the Espionage Act for the quote-unquote crime of exposing information about the US drone program. He made clear that around 90% of those people killed in the drone program were innocent people. And now he looks to be facing up to 10 years in prison. Within his heart-rending letter that he sent to the judge, he said the following, that during his time in Afghanistan, he became increasingly aware that the war had very little to do with preventing terror from coming into the United States and a lot more to do with protecting the profits of weapons manufacturers and so-called defense contractors. He said, we now kill people without ever seeing them. Now you push a button thousands of miles away. Since it's all done by remote control, there is no remorse. Hale went on to say, the evidence of this fact was laid bare all around me. In the longest and most technologically advanced war in American history, contract mercenaries outnumbered uniform-wearing soldiers 2-1 and earned as much as 10 times their salary. Meanwhile, it did not matter whether it was, as I had seen, an Afghan farmer blown in half, yet miraculously conscious and pointlessly trying to scoop his insides off the ground, or whether it was an American flag-draped coffin lowered into Arlington National Cemetery to the sound of a 21-gun salute. Bang, bang, bang. Both serve to justify the easy flow of capital at the cost of blood, theirs and ours. When I think about this, I am grief-stricken and ashamed of myself for the things I've done to support it. I came to believe that the policy of drone assassination was being used to mislead the public that it keeps us safe. And when I finally left the military, still processing what I'd been part of, I began to speak out, believing my participation in the drone program had been deeply wrong. Solidarity with Daniel Hale. We have also seen the US government attempt to get the country's civil courts to stop the disclosure of the employment details of Ansa Koulas. Of course, Harry Dunn was riding along the road in August 2019 in Northamptonshire on his bike. This 19-year-old was struck by a car coming out of a US military base and driving on the wrong side of the road. This car belonged to Ansa Koulas, who at the time was a CIA intelligence officer working in the military base there. We know that following that, she was assisted in leaving the country by Britain's Foreign Office. And actually, at that time, they claimed that she was the wife of a diplomat and enjoyed diplomatic immunity. Today, as I said, we are seeing the US government attempt to cover up the employment details of Ansa Koulas for the interest of quote unquote national security. As we know by some estimations, Britain is home to over 100 US military installations across the country. May they decrease by the day. We have also heard that the writer Simon Akam and his book, The Changing of the Guard, was effectively censored by Penguin at the behest of the Oxford Changing Character of War Programme's director, Robert Johnson. This book by Simon Akam was a critical analysis of the British Army's development, and particularly since 9/11 with its wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. At the point when Penguin had received this manuscript from Simon Akam, they were contacted by Robert Johnson, the director of Oxford's Changing Character of War programme. He told them that they would be very likely to face legal action if they went ahead with publishing this book. They then gave Simon Akam an ultimatum. They told him that he could either acquiesce and allow his book to be vetted by the Ministry of Defence and accept all corrections which were put to him, or he would have to go elsewhere to find a publisher. It's important to note that Robert Johnson, the director of this program at Oxford University, who contacted the publisher, of course, worked for the Ministry of Defence for 12 years. And according to his current bio on the Oxford University website, currently assists the UK Armed Forces and NATO. What we are seeing as an example of state censorship. Solidarity with Simon Akam, and we hope to be interviewing him soon on this podcast. Now, to get to the story of today, I am joined by the activist and the person who is performing a vital public service around the SpyCops inquiry, Tom Fowler. How are you doing, Tom?
Not bad, man. Glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me on.
Thanks so much for joining us. So if we can set the scene, March 1968. Of course, 1968 was the year in which US troop numbers in Vietnam reached their maximum level. You are looking at over 500,000 US soldiers in Vietnam that year. In fact, US spending in Vietnam also reached its peak, reaching about $77 billion for that year alone. In today's money, that is believed to be the equivalent of $576 billion US dollars. It was also the deadliest year of the war for the United States forces, and they lost around 16,000 soldiers of theirs were killed. Now, on March 16th, you saw US troops carry out the My Lai massacre, killing more than 500 Vietnamese civilians. The next day, you saw a massive demonstration in London, led by the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign. What happened next, Tom?
Well, I mean, like, the police lost control of that demonstration. A lot of the reports at the time said it was violence that had never been seen in London before. I mean, I think that's a bit of an exaggeration, but certainly the police were unable to control the crowd, which was attempting to occupy the US Embassy. Since that, I mean, it was one of the main characters there was Tariq Ali. I mean, he kind of was like the face of the campaign at that time, and he said that, you know, the idea was to get into the embassy and ring Hanoi and said they were in solidarity with the Vietnamese people. They were occupying the US Embassy. They didn't get that close. They got very close, though. There's a lot of footage of it on YouTube. You can see of the crowd basically just it's the old US Embassy. It's moved now, but it had a big like semicircular park in front of it, which is just full of cops trying desperately to hold back the crowd who will keep making incursions in. Because of that, there was an extraordinary meeting the next day of like all the top brass, the Home Secretary, all these sort of people, and a cop called Conrad Dixon said, "Give me." I think it was like £100,000 a year, 10 good men, and this will never happen again. They formed a unit they called the Special Operations Squad originally. It soon became the Special Demonstration Squad. And it set out initially just the main concern was there's going to be another Vietnam Solidarity Campaign protest in the October. And the plan essentially was to infiltrate that campaign and make sure that the October event was not a repeat of the March event, or something worse. They were successful at that. I would think it's fair to say. There was 10 officers deployed into local anti-Vietnam War solidarity groups, mostly the VSC, but there was a multitude of other groups at this time. Though, like in the March demonstration, most of those groups had managed to work together. There were Maoists, anarchists, all sorts of different groups, and they were managing to operate, under the same plan for that demonstration. By the October demonstration, partially due to the influence of undercover officers in those units, not only are they doing different things, the main march now takes place as a show of strength through Hyde Park, nowhere near the US Embassy. It goes off without any public order concerns. The unit, the Special Demonstration Squad, after that success, but the more we learn about it, the more we realize that actually they had already stretched out before October had come around. They start infiltrating, well, pretty much any group, any political group on the left, anything which was considered subversive or engaged in public disorder was targeted.
And in your case, Tom, you not only were a member of Eat Out Vegan Wales, you were also involved in other subversive organizations that got infiltrated. Is that right?
Yeah. So I mean, like fast forwarding then to like kind of the mid 2000s, I was, and I guess still am, one of the South Wales anarchists. Specifically at that time, a group called Cardiff Anarchist Network. Also involved a lot with No Borders stuff. As you say, I've been involved in animal rights, and Eat Out Vegan Wales was a social group, which a undercover police officer who was he was in a successor unit, a second unit called the National Public Order Intelligence Unit. His undercover name was Marco Jacobs. We don't know his real name, though it's likely, as most of these undercover officers, that Marco was his real first name, and his surname was one that he'd taken. By that point, we don't believe that he had taken the name of a dead child, though we're not 100% sure. But certainly, originally, or after the film The Day of the Jackal had come out, the unit decided, according to a former undercover officer, having watched the film, well, they all went to watch the film in the cinema together, to take the identities of dead children for their legend. So if somebody died when they were young, they took their name. We don't believe Michael Jacobs did that, but we're not sure. Anyway, he infiltrated our group over a period of about 4 years before he disappeared. I mean, that led me to be one of the first people to bring legal action against the police in a civil claim back in 2013, I guess now. Which was ultimately successful, as in they paid us off before we could get, as it happens with those sort of civil cases. And so through the process of doing that, I came to follow all the legal cases that were being brought by those people who were affected by the deployment of undercover officers. There was like over 140 of them over that from 68 onwards, infiltrating over 1,000 groups. So there's been quite a lot of them, quite a lot of people affected. Part of their the tactic of being deployed into groups to as their legend for their cover, they would get into a relationship, often a fairly serious relationship, with a female activist, or in some cases just a woman who was associated on the fringes of political activity. Mates with people who were went to the same pubs, that sort of thing. And in some cases, those became quite long-term, intimate sexual relationships, which in some cases resulted in the birth of children. So there's been quite a number of those women. We know of over 20 of them. I think 22 is the current number of women who were deceived into sexual relationships who were part of the inquiry. There are many more. I mean, like certainly in the case of Mark Kennedy, who was the first one to be unmasked whilst deployed, in a public way anyway. He probably had that many sexual relationships while he was deployed himself. A lot of them. There's a lot of similarities as well between the way in which they operated in terms of using women, not just as props for their cover, but also as means to which to further infiltrate groups. Particularly, I mean, the first big example we have of that was a guy called Rick Gibson, or his cover name was Rick Gibson, who infiltrated the Troops Out movement in the 1970s, which was the campaign against the deployment of soldiers into Northern Ireland. It wasn't an Irish Republican campaign, but an anti-militarist campaign in the UK. He deceived two women into, at least two women into long-term sexual relationships, whilst getting himself elected through the layers of the Troops Out movement until he became the national secretary of that movement, essentially the person running it entirely. Yeah.
So it's interesting that we have a wide array of groups across this, around 1,000 organizations that were infiltrated. Where can people find a sort of searchable database where they can see the list of organizations which were subject to this policy?
Yeah, if you check out there's a group called the Undercover Research Group, of which I'm involved. The website undercoverresearch.net. We contribute to Powerbase, which is the Spinwatch, I think. So there's a lot of articles on Powerbase. Essentially, since the inquiry started back in, the inquiry was called back in 2015, but it only started last November, though there was lots of pre-hearings. We've had quite a lot of new information that's come out since then, and it's taken quite a while to process it all. So a lot of it is work in flux. There are new articles, there are new profiles appearing all the time. But the Undercover Research Group would be the place to start for that, really. Yeah. And although the Guardian has covered it quite well, and there is actually a database on the Guardian where you can look up the various groups, I believe. But if you go to spycops.info, you can find links to everything related to the topic, really.
What's interesting to me also is that the public discussion around cancel culture, it may focus on the NUS's no platform policy adopted in 1974, but simultaneous to them setting that no platform policy, they would be very likely to have been, because we know they're one of the organizations that were infiltrated, they would very likely have had someone within their organization working for the Special Demonstration Squad. But also there's a crossover between what was happening and the process of blacklisting workers. Could you tell us a bit about that, please?
Yeah, so there's in terms of the blacklisting, there was an organization called the Economic League, which was first a consulting association, and the Economic League, one friend from the other. They maintained a database of problem construction workers. This was a private organization, but from what we've learned from the fantastic work that Dave Smith from the Blacklist Support Group have done in research in exposing the blacklist, that a lot of the information that these private companies, which were supplying the major construction industry companies with the names of health and safety officers who were a bit too overzealous, but also included information that had been gathered by Special Demonstration Squad officer, and NPO and ORU officers, undercover officers, police officers were giving information to this private company, and vice versa, we believe. Certainly there was, as we always see in these things, as it always seems to be the case, as will surprise nobody, there was a revolving door to a certain extent between those kind of organizations and that section of Special Branch.
So here we have a way in which people were literally being cancelled. There are examples of people, once they've been blacklisted, their family situations falling apart. There are examples of people later on, suicides in some cases. These are real, tangible ways in which people were actually cancelled, not in the theatrical aesthetics of the media circus, in real everyday life. And however, that's not included in our understanding of real forms of censorship. But what were you going to say, Tom?
No, absolutely bang on. There's so many stories of people who've, the ones I mentioned there was the construction blacklist, but there are numerous other blacklists. Somebody like Richard Chesham, who was a very, very qualified professional, who it would appear, because he had been told about an undercover officer who had been exposed, like a group called Big Flame, exposed Rick Gibson, the guy I talked about earlier from the Troops Out movement. He was given proof that they discovered the death certificate of the child whose identity he'd stolen, and they presented it to this undercover officer, who came up with a load of baloney and disappeared, emptied his flat, was never seen again. Richard Chesham was somebody who was entrusted with the information. He contacted an Observer journalist about it. he was blacklisted. He was found it impossible to get a job. He applied for thousands of jobs, never got a job offer, let alone never got any jobs out of it. Ended up, working like a very manual job, much below his abilities. But so many examples of this, and like you say, genuinely cancelled. People literally taken out of the game. This is, I think, very much part of the strategy of the repression by the British state. Is that one way or another they will keep you, they'll busy you out of it. You know what I mean? Whether that's because you can't get work or because one of their agents got you pregnant and now you're a full-time mum. Do you know what I mean? Like, literally just taking people out of activism, taking people out of politics, quite literally cancelling people.
And it's quite important that we emphasize to people quite the scale of what was happening. Yes, we're talking about organizations like the CND or the anti-apartheid movement, but we're also talking about Greenpeace. We're talking about the Fire Brigades Union. We're talking about the RMT. We're talking about the National Union of Teachers. We're talking about the NUS, as I said. We're talking about Eat Out Vegan Wales. We're talking about Houseman's Bookshop, the Rebel Clown Army, and the US Hedgehog Rescue Committee. These are huge swaths of people who are having their private business seen and surveilled by clearly very, very cynical actors. What I found quite interesting is you suggest that one of the reasons that, in comparison, you look at the National Front at that time, in the 70s, making major electoral gains, marching through London communities, which were hubs of migrants and ethnic minorities. But part of the reason that there wasn't the same focus by the Special Demonstration Squad on the National Front and figures from the right as there was on groups from the left, like Socialist Workers' Party and others, is that actually when you read their reports, the Special Demonstration Squad guys seem to demonstrate quite similar views around race. I mean, in addition to that, when the boss agents of the apartheid government were attempting to bomb the ANC HQ in London about 3 times in the 70s and the 80s, rather than investigating those events, you had Special Branch and Special Demonstration Squad figures infiltrating the groups that those activists worked within, spying on them, and giving that information to the apartheid government. So what we're actually seeing is, rather than there being this center which is placed between the left and the right as almost a neutral arbiter, that's very much the liberal claim that that's what the state does. We actually see the state as a vehicle for racism.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would go further. I would say that members of the police in general, particularly the Met Police in general at the time, were openly supportive of the National Front. The way consider, South Africa was an ally and was treated as an ally, and its security services were treated like an ally, just like Britain treats other security services of its allies in the same way. You're passing information over and helping them out however they can, and that included keeping an eye on the anti-apartheid solidarity activists in the UK, South Africans who were against apartheid who came to the UK. Some of those activists got targeted when they returned to South Africa from information which would have come from the Special Demonstration Squad. Throughout the 70s, there's this huge rise in racist politics, right? Racist street politics. During that time, one Special Demonstration Squad officer infiltrates a National Front group. He does that because at the time he's undercover in the Workers' Revolutionary Party, and either by his suggestion or supposedly because he was asked to, he infiltrates the National Front on their behalf. So he becomes a double agent. When he does so, he tells his bosses in the SDS, they seem to be up to no good, this local National Front group. We probably should send an officer in there properly, not just me doing this. They're like, don't you worry about that, son. That's not our concern. And something that we heard repeatedly, because as part of the inquiry, we've heard the evidence from numerous undercover officers from the time, though a great many have managed to wriggle themselves out of giving evidence, those who are still alive. But, it's put to them, why was there no targeting of the National Front? And they said, well, no, the National Front weren't a problem. And literally, I mean, they say that without irony. Do you know what I mean? They weren't causing, as far as that wasn't our area. We were concerned with subversive groups. Now, the National Front were loyal to Britain, and it's what we see in that, like, you see it in the fucking bourgeois press and the chattering classes, like this idea that, like, whilst left-wing ideas are dangerous, subversive, and in the pay of foreign governments, that like racism is legitimate white working class concerns, it's utter bullshit. Like, the right is like given a pass. I mean, it is my opinion, having like followed a lot of this stuff, that the shape of British politics was fundamentally altered by the undermining and systemic infiltration of left-wing groups by the Special Demonstration Corps and other groups. And I mean, this is only one very small part of like state repression of radical politics. But at the same time, so much oxygen, so much space was given to far right groups to operate, to organize in a way in which, if the left had attempted to do some of the tactics that I mean, like in the 80s, we see a couple of times where, like, class war goes to Henley Regatta. It'd been a little bit of a thing for, like, lefties to turn up to rich areas and give them some shit. But this was like, you compare that to the way, the level of which the National Front targeted areas with, West Indian populations, South Asian populations, whatever, and directly attacking those people. It's just a different level. I mean, if the left did that to rich areas, I mean, like, they got shut down so fucking quickly, man. It's not even a joke. Like, I mean, that's why I think that, the far right in Britain has had this, this give, like, armchair rides in British politics for so long, and has stoked up what we've got today, with like the prevalence of, like, whilst a lot of it isn't like overtly fascist, is bloody near enough. Do you know what I mean?
Well, yeah, what you're talking about is the state collaborating with the apartheid regime to target its dissenters here in this country and passing information to them. You're talking about some of the stuff that was written in the reports, clearly racist kind of ideas about people. As you have sort of made the point, they infiltrated the Women's Liberation Front at a time where it was, women weren't able to open their own bank accounts. Right. And they seem to have been, their agents within the organization seem to have been quite important in the kind of falling apart of that organization. So they were a force for definitely very right-wing things. But you've spoken about this as being about fighting social attitudes. Can you expand on that, please?
Yeah, totally. I mean, like, it's something which was, very much the fore when you look at what was being said about why the left-wing agitators were such a problem. I mean, they weren't just they weren't so concerned about the anti-Vietnam War campaign just because of its opposition to that particular conflict, but also, the direction that not just Britain, but like the youth of Europe, was going at that time. Like the late 60s, you had this huge development of radical ideas in lots of senses, and like the women's equality, the women's liberation movement, like, as them as an example, I mean, they were calling for things which now we would consider like really just mainstream, like criminalize rape, allow women to have a bank account, don't put any barriers in the way of illegitimate children, all these kind of really basic things, which now you look at it and you go, these were radicals, what the fuck, you know what I mean? And there were so many of these things. I mean, apartheid was not popular in Britain. The deployment of troops to Northern Ireland was not popular in Britain. In the invasion of Vietnam was not popular in Britain. These were things which they had to, manufacture consent for in one way, and they had to repress the dissent against, we see it. So like we look at like kind of the strength of feeling on those things, and they couldn't stop it entirely, man. It was like you're trying to plug up a broken dam. It was coming through anyway. Do you know what I mean? The days of the apartheid were numbered. Like, Western imperialism was going to fall in Vietnam. They will never, the British state will never fully control the 6 counties. Like all these things, they can't completely hold them back. but like they fought fucking hard and as dirty as they possibly can for so long to do that. And I think, you know, I mean, one of the, you know, the great things I always like kind of feel like the great defeat of the miners' strike, which I think like casts a huge shadow over, you know, any kind of progressive politics like since then, you know, that like the defeat of the pushing back, the holding suppression of these movements really did shape like kind of the ascent of Thatcherism and the way in which the right of the Tory party completely has the whip hand. You know, it's entirely in British politics now.
Yeah. I mean, it would also be interesting perhaps to look at the trajectory in moving from Special Demonstration Squad to the kind of war on terror era through a kind of profile of Bob Lambert. This was somebody who was in the SDS between 1983 and 1988. We know that he infiltrated Greenpeace during that time. He was using the identity of a boy who had died at the age of 7. He actually fathered a child with an activist, even though he already had a wife and kids. And that child has gone on to sue the Metropolitan Police for all of the havoc this caused. He's also been accused of planting a bomb at Debenhams while undercover. Could you tell us a bit about Bob Lambert, MBE?
Yeah, sure. I mean, like Bob Lambert, in a lot of ways, kind of felt like you look at the SDS before and after the Lambert years, if you know what I mean. He was a field officer. He infiltrated a number of groups, including some the Animal Liberation Front and the more sort of direct action end of animal rights. With that, the Animal Rights Militia, I think, was the group who he was a part of that. Planted a bomb, or attempted to plant. Did plant a bomb in Debenhams. He was like other people got done for that. I mean, he has never faced any consequences of it. After he'd been a field officer, he became a backroom officer in the unit, which is a very common sort of trajectory. A lot of the senior officers, the later senior officers, had been field officers earlier on. He wrote a number of reports where he slagged off the unprofessionalism of certain officers and praised others and himself largely for the way in which they'd managed to go much deeper into groups than had previously earlier been the case, or they felt had been the case. He was the first, we believe him to be the first author of the Tradecraft Manual, which was one of the first documents that the Undercover Policing Inquiry released. It was obviously added to later on, but he was like one did the first draft, where we really see the sort of the dehumanization of the targets of these of this unit. You get a lot of ways of writing about people to like kind of diminish their humanity really in the eyes of these officers. They created their own slang, their own code, their own way of talking about people. They were the hairies. Their targets were the wearies. We would make them weary for talking about politics, so on. But yeah, I mean, he went on to have a very glittering career. He was in the police for a great deal of time. He went over to academia. It's not an area I'm an expert on him, but he was one of the authors of the Prevent strategy, which to be honest, you'd know far more about than me. But he was unmasked as Bob Robinson, which was the name that he used when he was in the field, by Helen Steele and former members of London Greenpeace at an academic conference. At that point, he was the darling really of like a lot of this sort of terror studies, kind of that whole like weird, far like right wing kind of approach to like kind of conflict resolution, which is absolute bullshit. Like, and he was a big part of this whole sort of strategy of the whole prevent thing. Yeah.
Well, it's also sort of interesting how this infrastructure of domestic extremism, as they would depict seemingly all people hoping to progress society on a social level, to improve it, to make it more equal, to make the disparity between the rich and the poor smaller, to fight for the rights of working people, to protect the vulnerable. These are the extremists of society, how it sort of seamlessly seemed to transform into the infrastructure of what would be the war on terror years, he set up the Muslim Contact Unit. He also, as far as I understand, was responsible for deploying officers to spy on the Stephen Lawrence family. Could you tell us a bit more about some of the spying campaigns, some of the spying on these sort of family-run campaigns? Also, Blair Peach is another one. Tell us a bit about.
I mean, I think Blair Peach is a perfect example. It wasn't the first family justice campaign for someone who died because of police action. Blair Peach was beaten to death at a protest against the National Front in Southall, 1979. He was attacked by 6 members of the Special Patrol Group, led by an officer called Alan Murray, who is alive and well and has never faced any consequences. Those Special Patrol Group officers had homemade weapons, and at least one of them kept Nazi memorabilia in his home and in his locker at work. He was killed by a Kosh, not a truncheon. So that's why it's believed that it was Alan Murray who was the one who had the weapon that would fitted. But his funeral was attended by 18 undercover officers, though no undercover officer had been on the day, according to the records. This is despite the fact that every single other of these major protests against the National Front, of which there had been several over the previous few years, Lewisham 77 is probably the most famous one, but there were lots of these, and they were always like 3-line whip essentially for undercover officers to be in the field for those, because they brought out the whole of the left. They brought out the anarchists, they brought out the Maoists, they brought out the Social Workers Party. They also brought out the community, the actual people who the National Front were targeting. So the Special Demonstration Squad had really focused on anti-National Front activity as being like their main concern. They weren't infiltrating the National Front. They were doing their very best to stop groups who were opposing the National Front. Often these were, monitoring groups who were like, people who, mixed race couples getting their windows smashed. They would go and sit on the wall outside the house, and these are the groups who are getting. I'm describing infiltration, often that's, it's an officer going into your life, becoming your friend. And one of the things earlier when you were saying about all those different groups, to understand that, it's that they weren't infiltrating the groups, they were infiltrating the lives of the people in the groups. And they were completely joining that life. They were going to sports games, family events, weddings, christenings, funerals, they were infiltrating the very lives of people. So they ended up in all the groups that people were involved with, whether they were like very extremely political or not, So they literally, the Friends of Blair Peach campaign, from the very get-go, from the meetings where it's discussed setting up the campaign, there are undercover police officer reports. They're putting officers as close to the people affected. Celia Stubbs, Blair Peach's partner, and the people who knew him. He was from New Zealand, so majority of his family wasn't in this country, so it was friends and his partner more so, and her children. That they kept as close to tab as possible, and every single protest that was that happened about that, and there were a lot of protests. People were very upset about the death of Blair Peach, rightly so. It was a disgusting murder that took place in broad daylight. They were all monitored very, very closely. They were, as it went on, every single family justice campaign, not from the get-go, from the officers, the family liaison officers, passing any information they have about the family straight to the Special Demonstration Squad, or later the National Public Order Intelligence Unit, monitoring every aspect of it. The chief concern of the police, and we see this in pretty much every single, every one you've never heard of, every death at the hands of the police, or racist murder that's where the justice isn't happening. The police are infiltrating it. The police are sending their officers into these family groups, and monitoring them for 40, 50 years. We've got reports of Celia Stubbs has been monitored by undercover police for 40 years. Every aspect, every kind of the details of her movements on the anniversary of her partner's death are recorded without fail throughout. And yeah, certainly the justice campaign for Stephen Lawrence, the family justice campaign for him being infiltrated, was probably one of the strongest reasons why we've ended up with an inquiry, because I think like when it comes to genuine anti-racist justice campaigns that have got actually some ability to like kind of affect public opinion in this country, I think the Lawrence campaign is like the number one of that, right? And I think their influence was the reason why we got the inquiry, to be honest.
So another case where we know someone had been victim to what appears to have been a racist murder or a racist killing, at least in Kingston, was the case of Ricky Real. His family were also subjected to spying on their campaign. Could you tell us a bit about that case?
Yeah, sure, man. I mean, like, the case of Ricky Real is one of so many like heartbreaking stories of just, just horror, man. Like the death of Ricky Real is still, nobody's been held accountable for it. It seemed pretty, like so many of these things, it seems pretty obvious who it was. But it's, it's yet another clear case of the police just not seeing, not seeing the full value of the life of someone who's not got white skin, essentially. And the family was targeted by undercover police. We don't know a huge amount of detail from it because the inquiry is releasing information in to the core participants, those who are affected, in a chronological manner, and they've been incredibly slow. We're still we're only just out of the 1970s so far, and it's going to be quite a while before we get to the case of Ricky Real's justice campaign. But given her advanced age, Sir Jeffrey Real, her mother, Ricky Real's mother, has had a meeting with the chair of the inquiry, Sir John Mitting, and asked, given her advanced age and health, if it would be possible for her evidence to be released to her sooner than was expected. He assured her that he would do that. He has not done that. She was asked who was the undercover officer. He told her he would tell her that. He has not done that. This is one of the things, time and again, where Sir John Mitting does not live up to his word, quite frankly, and his word's not up to much either, really. I mean, you get the impression, like with so many things, that if people would just hurry up and die, then they don't have to worry about it anymore, and that's the kind of the approach the inquiry's kind of had with that. Really,
we've established that sex seemed to be being used. To what extent can we say that was something that was it either a case of those along the hierarchy turned a blind eye to it, or to what extent can we say it was something that was encouraged? So
there's been a lot of questions asked of the former undercover officers at the inquiry about this topic. And a great many have said they don't really remember, that they never really talked about their individual deployments to each other in the safe house, which, considering they couldn't say it to anybody else, not very believable. But one former officer, Graham Coates was his cover name, was a lot more candid. His code of silence on like the death of Blair Peach stayed strong, but when it came to the systemic abuse of women by the unit, he was very candid. He said that it was the major topic of conversation, that it was openly celebrated, that the officers would discuss the particulars of the sexual liaisons with those women, which would be encouraged, and the humor around it would have been, it was put to him, it's been put repeatedly by police lawyers, that we shouldn't judge the language and the attitudes of the time against now, that, what we would consider unacceptable misogyny now, back then would have been just normal, day-to-day banter. But according to Graham Coates, that the level of misogyny and like degradation of women, the language used, would have been shocking at the time to other members of the police force, let alone wider society. Now, when we know how incredibly misogynistic the police force was at the time, which is, there's plenty of contemporaneous evidence of that to do with, the experience of those women PCs at the time, of which the initial Special Demonstration Squad had a couple, but they got rid of them very early on, and it became a boys' club for the majority of its history. Essentially, once they were a bit worried about the women's liberation movement. So once they'd sent a couple of women officers into that, and had got it to, this very small group, of which a group of 3, which included one of their undercover officers, expelled huge swathes of the movement and eventually crashed it in. They decided they didn't need women officers anymore, and it was much better if it was just a boys' club. To me, it was certainly encouraged on a as a perk of the job, essentially, with the early days of the unit. I think from Rick Gibson on, what we see instead is much more of a cynical use of, it's not just getting your jollies and having and like kind of enjoying yourself on the side while doing the job, but using it specifically as a means of not just ingratiating yourself within a group, but like manipulating the social forces within the group and the interpersonal relationships that exist there in order to get yourself up the hierarchy, split up the group, whatever it is you were setting out to do. Certainly, Rick Gibson did that very effectively. Did that. Bob Lambert did that a whole hope of a lot, and I mean Mark Kennedy, I think really, blew it out the water really. Yeah.
So we know that there weren't many women, but we do know that there was somebody who went by the name of Lynn Watson.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about her, please.
Yeah, so Lynn Watson I think she was like the 3rd or 4th undercover officer to be exposed back in 2011. She would been deployed into peace campaigns, the Aldermaston Women's Peace Camp, and a number of other groups that were involved into the opposition, the lead up to the G8 summit that was in Gleneagles in 2005. As part of that, she joined a group called the Clandestine Insurrectionary Rebel Clown Army, circa, which were essentially like a bit of one of those kind of like tongue-in-cheek kind of street theater type protest groups. Yeah, I mean, like I remember at the time, I always just find circa really irritating, to be honest. Like, just like, oh God, just like, but they were a fun sort of like kind of, you imagine like kind of a lot of like theatrical types kind of get involved in activism and like looking at ways of doing things. And this thing of like dressing up as clowns and like kind of taking the mick out of the whatever it is that they were protesting against, mostly military targets, and also like, the over policing of protest. She got involved in that. There's a lot of footage of her in the clown outfit, making silly noises and doing all those things that they did. Yeah, she was someone who she didn't. None of the women officers. There have been women officers who had sex with activists over the years. It appears she didn't. She had a fictitious boyfriend, it would appear, as her sort of explanation of that. She was exposed after she'd disappeared, like so many of them. One of the ways in which people kind of, certainly the way in which we decided that we thought that Marco Jacobs the guy who was infiltrating our group was probably a cop, was when Peter Francis, who was an undercover officer who was deployed into Youth Against Racism in Europe in the 1990s as Peter Black, went whistleblower in about, I think it was 2010, 2011. He explains about the extraction process, which is basically, you a couple of months lead up, a lot of use of trauma. One of the hallmarks of the way in which the undercover officers would manipulate themselves in groups and build their cover was through trauma. They always had like traumatic stories from their past. Interestingly, we see like a real kind of pattern of like the individual stories that undercover officers learned about their targets in previous deployments seem to crop up in the legends of later officers. It's certainly something to do with like a lot of the undercover officers claim to have been adopted, brought up by other family members, various sort of like traumatic things to do with previous relationships was very common. And a lot of them, when it came to being withdrawn, it was often through, claims of having a mental breakdown, suffering severe trauma from a previous event which had somehow revisited itself, and their need to leave the country, their need to go elsewhere. That after a couple of months of laying that down, they would then disappear, go home to their wife and children. They were all married with children. That was a prerequisite for being an officer. One had not been in the past, and it was considered this was a terrible problem, and that They always needed not just to be married with children, but in a very secure marriage. So it was often, it was the case that once the unit got going, it didn't happen at first, which was seen as a problem, because sometimes the marriages weren't happy, and undercover officers with the opportunity of the infidelity that the deployment gave them that their marriages would break down, and that wasn't any good to the unit. They needed to be in solid marriages. So they would, the wife would be interviewed as part of the whole process. We've heard from the ex-wives of former undercover officers who spoke about their great embarrassment. They'd always believed that their husbands were doing something very noble, that they were involved in very serious work, kind of protecting the realm. This kind of mythologized idea of like the secret services. In reality, they were sleeping around and targeting legitimate protest groups. But they would return to their families. Over the next 3 months, they would send postcards from wherever they claimed they'd gone away to. So in case that was South Africa, New Zealand, Germany. In Marco's case, it was Corfu, which he had. It always been part of his supposed history that he used to work out there, and he gets a job back there, which kind of it always made sense. They planted the seeds for their withdrawal in the early days of their deployment, with kind of how they sold their story of who they were.
Just
go on. Yeah.
Sorry, Tom. Just also to, this can't be depicted as some sort of rogue unit just acting willy-nilly, when you've got someone like Norman Tebbit in Thatcher's government seeming to have quite precise information about where trade union leaders go on holiday. How far up did this thing go?
All the way to the top, no two ways about it. We've seen the annual reports, which are for the Home Secretary just to sign off to make sure that the funding continues for next year. I mean, some of those are absolutely laughable. Though it's been a quiet year, we're sure that that there are elements who are just waiting for the next problem to jump on and exploit for their anti-police agenda or their anti-whatever agenda. All the Home Secretaries knew. Certainly. Tony Blair knew. There were reports, going straight away to him. I mean, what's interesting actually is there were those at the head of, right at the heart of government, who had been spied upon. Say, like Peter Hain, right? Peter Hain had now Lord Hain was very active in the anti-apartheid movement, which was the second major national campaign that the Special Demonstration Squad heavily targeted with the Stop the 70 tour in 1969. He was spied on for decades, so much so that in 2004, while he was a member of the cabinet, he voted for the Iraq War. He was a loyalist, a Tony Blair loyalist within the cabinet. He was spied on by Mark Kennedy, and in the report referred to as the noted South African terrorist. He was father of the House of Commons at the time. I mean, it's like it. I mean, it just showed that the only political party in Britain that wasn't infiltrated was the Conservative Party. I mean, it just shows that you can go as far as what you can become. You can become a lord. You can be at the heart of government. You're still scum to these people. These units, both the Special Demonstration Squad and the National Public Order Intelligence Unit, were set up under Labour governments. There's no two ways about it. The Labour government knew about the existence of these units whilst they were in power. Certainly, the Home Secretary and the Prime Minister would have done, and took no steps to curtail them at all. But I think it's really important to always understand in Britain that the Tories aren't always in power, but it's their state. So essentially just that.
And the trajectory of someone like Andy Coles kind of illustrates that. Could you tell us a bit about him and what he's doing now?
Yeah, sure. So Andy Coles he's the brother actually of the Reverend Richard Coles, which is actually how we found out that he was an undercover officer, because Richard Coles put it in his autobiography as a little bit of colour in there, and exposed his brother, which I'm sure is, it makes for a good topic around the table anyway. But anyway, he was, Andy Davey was the cover name he used whilst he infiltrated animal rights groups in London in the 90s. He was in his early 30s then, but like a lot of undercover officers, they'd use the opportunity to lower their age significantly, so much so that he was able to deceive a 19-year-old girl to be his partner. He had a relationship with a woman who uses the pseudonym Jessica now. I really recommend following her on social media. She's very good. He was infiltrated animal rights groups for a number of years. He was the second author of the Tradecraft Manual, and he really added his own personal sort of really kind of geeky style of report writing, which is very, very prevalent within this weird humor they seem to have. It's a lot of like kind of inserting song lyrics into things a lot, and this kind of like, yeah, he was one of those guys.
Just tell us exactly what the Tradecraft Manual was.
Okay, so the Tradecraft Manual was a document which it was one of these sort of documents which it was obviously put into a file. There was very limited numbers of it. I think it was passed to new officers for them to read. It would go through the sort of like the tactics used and the types of groups that you'll be infiltrating. They're kind of just like kind of a bit of a character like sketch of them. They break down sort of groups. It's in some cases like in ways in which you can really recognize, others of which you're just like, what the hell are they on about? A lot of it's been redacted, huge swathes of it redacted, so there's lots of bits of it which are missing. But I mean, certainly it's full of these sort of dehumanization sort of comments, talking about people living in squats, eating like moldy food, which is just like nobody does that. It's like not something that you as a human being would do. You don't, but like just them sort of constantly undermining the sort of the humanity of the targets. He was author of that. He went on to have a successful policing career when he came out of the police. He was a member of the Conservative Party. He stood as a local councillor, which he was successful of. He became the Deputy Police and Crime Commissioner. He resigned from that role when it was exposed that he had deceived a woman into a long-term sexual relationship. He's still though a councillor, Tory councillor in Peterborough Council. He's a cabinet member now of the council. He's still, despite his personal history, he's got various roles as a school governor and has spoken out on safeguarding issues for young girls. Which it's just fucking sick, man. But yeah, he is very bullish about it. He denies everything, despite overwhelming evidence, clear, blatant evidence of his behaviour. He's well remembered. There's photographs of him. It was hoped he was up for election not long ago, earlier this year, and what is traditionally a very, very safe Conservative seat. Sadly, he kept his seat, but he's reduced the majority down to much lower numbers than ever should be, really, for that kind of seat.
So, Tom, thank you so much for that. If you can tell us where to follow you for important documentation of what is happening at this quite well-concealed, quote-unquote, public inquiry, I would encourage everyone to support what Tom is doing. This is a public service, not only to generations around now, but also to the generations of the past and the generations coming ahead. Where can we keep in contact with what you're doing, Tom?
So like when the inquiry is sitting, I live tweet everything that's happening on Twitter. My username is Tom B. Fowler. I do a regular podcast myself with me, a guy called Chris from the Undercover Research Group, and pretty much anybody who's been affected. We've had people from Police Spies Out of Lives, Campaign Opposing Police Surveillance, lawyers, researchers, activists, women who are deceived into long-term sexual relationships on the show. Comes up pretty much every week. That's called SpyCops Info. You can find that and links to everything related to it, all those groups I just listed, at spycops.info. And subscribe wherever you get podcasts. It's not on YouTube yet. There's no video. It's just audio. I might upload it to YouTube at some point. But yeah, check that out. If you look up for the hashtag SpyCops on pretty much all social media, that'll keep you up to date as well as anything would.
Thank you so much, Tom.